Hey, good morning, everyone. David Cross here, and I thought I'd do something different again today. So this morning, I'm sitting here thinking I have an application that allows me to go out and query DNS statistics that I've written and talks to the DNS server and uses the new DNS Statistics channels that allow you to pull back attributes and functional parameters and metrics about how the server is operating and queries and counters and so forth. And I realized that when I had updated my latest one to version 9, bind 9.11, that there were some new counters and features, and I had to go back in and rebuild this. And I started thinking, how is it easier? Is it easier in another scripting language, or is it easier elsewhere to get these statistics? And would there be something administrators could use? So today's session is kind of going to talk about bind 9 statistics, or statistics on the server, and how you can really query it via PowerShell, and the example today, and quickly, and really what those stats will provide for you. So I have just pulled up the interface on my DNS server that I'm managing, which again is through the BT bind DNS and ISC DNS compliant. It's running version bind 9.11 to patch 1. And within the new statistics channels that I've configured, it gives you a nice little web interface that allows you to see the information like queries, notifies, updates, transfers, and typical statistic information that has, for many years and before bind 9.5, had been provided through the RNDC stats channel, which you had to run through a command line. But they have this new XML capable statistics channel that if you compile the live XML in with it, you can pull the stats back. And it's a very nice utility. It gives you some really in-depth capabilities. And as you kind of navigate down through the different categories, you get status, your server, the queries and zones and types that we just saw, and even down into the zones where you can see what zones are being queried and other details. So real quick on the setup of this, if you haven't done this before, in your IP control screens, go ahead and configure, edit your DNS server, and ensure that it's running at least bind 9.9 or later. And you should see a statistics tab that's going to allow you to define the IP address to listen on, the port, who are you going to accept messages from or allow to communicate to this port. And I have an access list control set up, and I recommend you do as well. And I'm going to skip the RNDC keys from this for now, as I'm going to use just straight, web invokes and things that are not going to have that option to do that. So that's real simple. And then once you've configured the statistics channel, you would need to deploy the changes. Now, for those who are running production, make sure this falls within your process. If you're running dynamic zones and you have a schedule for deploying changes, make sure this works within that change itself. But more specifically, we need the ability to deploy the configuration. And once that configuration is deployed, simply go out and test it and navigate to that port and see if you can connect to the server. Okay, and then you should see your statistics, and we know things are working fine there. So what I want to do with this now is then kind of show you a couple of methods that are real easy to use in PowerShell, whereas in, say, Visual Studio and VBNet, where I program, it took quite a bit of cutting and pasting and modification. So the first thing to note is that the statistics channels, when compiled into the bind server, are stored as XML, which means that when we navigate to this page, although this is showing us graphs and counters, this is processing an XSLT style sheet that is formatting this information. But if I were to look at this in terms of page source, what I'm effectively going to get for all of this information is I'm going to get all of the XML. This whole process here is XML that's stored for the client. And I'm just going to copy it here. So I want to show you a few things. And in that XML, I'm going to go ahead and just paste that into a file, which I'm going to create. But the one thing we need to look at here, if you're processing this manually and you're not doing it through the calls and you want to test it manually, you'll need to edit this file, save it to a file, edit it, remove the empty first line, and then remove the style sheet line. All we want is the XML declaration and then the actual text. And I'm going to recommend too that if you haven't looked at any utilities or know of any applications out there like XML Notepad, I suggest you get this, or look at something online to allow you to view the XML. But that's basically what I have. So when you save your file, save it out to something we can look at. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll save this to temp, DNS Stats, XML. Okay, and then in my XML Notepad, I want to basically load that. Okay, now the key to this is understanding the different categories. So what I wanted to show here is in each of these categories, these should map up to the XML stats links on the top. And therefore, if you are only interested in certain aspects or certain pages, you can actually call into those specifically by the source and call out those attributes directly. All right, so when I was looking at the XML editor, I can call the server statistics directly. I can look at traffic views, socket manager, etc., by making calls into this particular XML using XML, the version, and then the particular category. It's like zones, servers, status, or just basically everything by leaving it empty. Okay. So get something that allow you to see this, so at least you can navigate through and get an understanding of how the XML is structured, what the different tags are, and so forth. Okay. So in this particular example, what I really want to do, and what's going to be interesting for me in this case, is to provide statistics on the types of queries and the number of queries that are being generated. So I'm going to jump over to my PowerShell and I'm just going to show you how simple this is. Now, the first part of this is I wanted to, in the example, pull out a URL that was going to talk to my server statistics. And the server statistics are going to give me the counters for the queries and the types. So I set the URL to server. I'm then going to create a variable that's then going to tell PowerShell to invoke a REST method, telling it to use the URL, and then to use the method get. Since this is just an HTML web page, we're going to use get to pull the parameters. And the second part of this script, or the line in the script, is going to be to create and pull out just the counters. So I have, let's go ahead and just play some of these out here. I'll go ahead and run this one here. We're going to go ahead and run the new stats. And the nice thing about this too is if you're looking at the variables, you can just expand it out, and then we can start doing the dot notation the way that PowerShell processes everything into an object. We can do dot notation to kind of navigate down through the XML tree, if you will, and start to look at the information. So we'll go down to server and so on, and so it kind of builds this out as we move through. Now the counters line here, I'm going to tell it to basically, in the stats, parse down based on the dot parameters and objects down through the statistics server and counters. I'm then going to pipe that counters to a where object where I'm going to be able to filter and say I want from this object just the Q type counters from these statistics. And then more specifically, I'm going to pipe that into another command that will expand the counter, which is the object array. So kind of to play that out, let's go ahead and play that. And then if I type out the counters, I then see my specific query types. So by doing this, and if you were kind of expanding this out and typing the different statistics, we could go in and pull out other values too, or other types of queries versus just the Q type that we selected. So we could pull out one of the others. I'm going to check and see what others we have and go from there. Okay. And I just cannot type today on a Friday. All right, so the other types that I have here are things like opcodes. If I want to see the number of queries by query type, opcode type, I can do the same thing with return codes, also stats, zone stats, and so on. So if I wanted this line to pull out instead of a variable to each of these, I would just replace Q type with this particular code like DNS stat or zone stat, and so on. And so that's kind of how easy that is to pull the data. And then I'm going to write that output, just kind of giving it a thing, and then, just passing counters like we just did in that list, we'll type out what's in the variable. Real simple. Okay, so my server, I reset this, it's been picking up and gaining steam. So I'm gonna, I can continue to run this. And each time I run this counters list or this script, it should increment the counters, and anything that's been updated, it'll, you'll see it increment the counter if I just keep doing this. And so I think that the value here from IT operations, DNS operations, is literally the monitoring of these to see if there are any type of queries that are excessive, maybe where we should put rate limiting, or just get general health of the server, and or set up scheduled intervals, so like once a minute, that you can then derive a queries per second, based on the count differences and averaging and so on. So, a nice way to quickly get to this within a couple lines of code. And then we could even wrap this around a list of servers, piping in a list of servers that tells it go out to query each one, pull back the stats, and then generate a table that averages this. That should be very simple, and maybe we'll do that in one of our exercises. And then the next part of the example really was that in the statistics, I can go out and also pull things like zones and others. So I'm going to, in this, I want to pull back all the stats. I could just do zones, but I wanted to pull all of them. And in this case, I'm going to pull out just the zone list. And the zone list in this particular case is found under Zone Stats, Statistics, Views, and View. So if I were to type this out in a dot notation, I should see the different views in terms of bind views that I can look at in terms of the counters. The default is effectively the default, but you could see different views if you're doing split DNS or implementing views in your environment. So the next part of that is I want to pull out just the default, which I have here, checking the name, and then pulling out the default value. And then I want to, effectively expand all the zones. So in the zone list, then I can go out and see, what are the zones? And I can then take a look at this from this perspective in a table. Or as I'm doing in this particular list, I'm telling it to go out and select just the name in the serial list for zones that have a serial number greater than 0, meaning at least 1. And the reason I did that is if we were to pull out just the name and serial number running just this particular zone, I'm going to get a bunch of empty zones which bind implements for the 100 space, the new RFC space that handles the 1918s. So they automatically zero these, and they of course are showing it zero's value. I don't want that because it's kind of messy. So I just wanted just the serial number of everything. And then kind of to run this whole program again, you get your stats, you can get your zone list. And again, we could probably pull out different stats or pull this into a table and or do more data with it, such as notifying if the serial numbers are mismatched, maybe comparing multiple servers and their serial numbers with their zones and things like that. So again, I just want to point that out. It's a great little utility. PowerShell simplifies this tremendously. And you see here with a line, 15 lines of code, I can pull these values out successfully. Whereas in my programs, I'm writing into hundreds, maybe 1,000 lines of code. So really great stuff. I'm going to come back with some other PowerShell API syntax, some things that I've done with this in terms of IP control, because the APIs that we work with are very simple to work. And I started working, building out a list of APIs I'm going to go through here in some of these video sessions as well. So I hope this helps. And if you're a DNS admin, this is a great way to do this in a PowerShell Powerline. And you can do all of this from your desktop as long as you're in, say, the access list that you provide and giving you quick access to the details. I know it saved me time. I'm sure it will you as well. So good luck, and I hope this helps. And we'll see you. Maybe I'll do some more tomorrow, or we'll reconnect again next week. Take care.